Do you know how long I've been waiting for this? Gambit, Horseman of Death, is reorganizing the metagame in his own image. Let's take a look at how he's doing it. Gambit V2 is a 3-3 with an objective to play 5 total cost of created cards. When you complete the objective, he destroys 4 total cost of cards on your opponent's side of the board. Technical questions. Yes, it is at least 5. You can go over 5. You don't need to hit exactly 5. When it comes to choosing targets, he will choose them seemingly randomly and then check and see how much more he has in the budget, so to speak. This means that he can choose things under armor, and those things will count against his budget of energy targets. In addition, this is a card that can either target like 1/4 or multiple smaller things, and choosing between those things seems to be entirely randomized. In terms of metagame effects, Gambit is quite good against some of the cards, especially Sholo decks, that have been really dominant recently. This is because what he does is clean up small things on the board. Decks like Sholo are composed of small things using each other's abilities to get bigger and more important and larger portions of the total power budget of the game. Gambit is a sort of direct counterplay to that. A lot of on-board decks really don't want to see this guy. Decks like Sholo, for example, where, you know, you're putting some guys on the board, but like if they blow up a Maverick, you are in big trouble. Or decks like Batroc is really probably the hardest hit by this, because Batroc, Sam Wilson, Craven, that's your best draw. They activate this fast enough, and they can do it off of Valentina a lot of the time. You're kind of just getting got. Your whole deck explodes if those cards get blown up, and it probably is blowing them up. So the number one thing Gambit is a counter to scalers. That primarily impacts the Batroc deck, secondarily impacts a lot of Sholo decks. Tertiary, it's also pretty impactful against Invisible Woman First Steps all-in decks. Gambit seems quite relevant in that matchup as well. What this does is push the metagame towards the decks that are simply not at all affected by him. I've been playing a lot of Star-Lord, I've been playing a lot of Ramp. There's just kind of a coterie of decks that really don't care about this guy. Ramp is sort of an obvious one, but that's not even like the most anti this you can get. Like negative Star-Lord, Gambit does practically nothing against that kind of deck. Normal Star-Lord, again, practically nothing. There's just a lot of ways to counter him, but most of them involve changing what you're doing as an archetype. He's almost a tech card when you really get down to it against scalers, against these onboard synergy combos. And considering we've been in a metagame that's been pretty heavy on those things, he's not necessarily unwelcome. What remains to be seen is whether he can maintain his play rate, how good he is at doing other things, especially because it does sort of seem like he has a pretty glaring weakness to decks that are willing to just like play a really big guy and then sort of look at you like, where are your points coming from, Mr. Gambit? Gambit's going to need an answer to that. So let's take a look at the decks people are playing with Gambit, and then rarely, as I do for one of these, quite rarely, we're going to take a look at some decks that just put him in a dumpster. We start with this list from Husky Puppies, which is looking to go quite as all in on Gambit as you possibly can. This is a deck that can get many copies of Gambit, and remember, each copy of Gambit that you get is a created card that'll contribute to all of their triggers. This is the kind of thing that is like very oppressively good against Sholo stuff. Like if you're able to get like 3 Gambit triggers, that deck doesn't have cards. And so that kind of thing, this kind of like build to this nut draw, is a lot of what you saw on day one, but then you start asking the questions because these are the exact kind of decks that are the most vulnerable to someone just being like, yeah, I'm going to rock up there with the Doom 2099. I'm going to rock up there playing the Infinite. I'm going to play, you know, Electro Blink, and it's just like, I'm good. That kind of stuff is where this deck really starts seeing some pushback, right? So the question is going to be largely, how much of this is justifiable if people are actually trying to beat you? This list comes from Husky Puppies. It's a very well put together list of extremely all-in Gambit. There's a bunch of ways to make sure that not only do you get Gambit triggers to happen, you get multiple Gambits. You can Prodigy the Gambit even after the objective has already gone off. You can Frigga the Gambit, you can Bastion the Gambit, and just generally, your goal here is to do something as stupid as possible. You also have all of this ability to do that stuff with Victoria Hand. So you do have a points package, even if it's a little iffy. Weirdly, the most important card in this deck felt to me like Quinjet. You're doing so much copying that once you start copying, you're just like, man, if I don't have the discount here, my hand is full of crap and I can't ever get rid of it. Quinjet does a lot to make this deck easier to play. I'm not going to say it's a snap condition, but it kind of is. Like, this is the... When you have Quinjet and some copiers, it's a lot harder to lose than otherwise would be true. The thing about this deck is because it's so all in on Gambit, it basically has his exact risk profile, which is to say it is really good against the stuff Gambit is good against. Like, way, way better than anything else has ever been against that kind of stuff. Like, if you're playing against the Invisible Woman First Steps, you can just erase their board. If you're playing against Sholo, you can just erase their board. But it also has all of those attendant weaknesses because that's kind of the only plan. It's the most all-in Gambit deck, probably the one I saw the most, and it's strong at doing something very specific, which is relevant to the current metagame. But if people start adjusting to this, I think it gets a little less relevant as time passes. You can also just get a little, like, zoomed out here and just be like, why are we going all in on Gambit? Why don't we just put Gambit in a Victoria Hand deck and just play some Marvel Snap? And that seems like a pretty reasonable way to go about things for me, but one of the key things that Victoria Hand decks have going for them largely is, wow, look at all this cheap stuff. Like, wow, I love having all my cheap stuff. And one of the things you really don't want to see is another Gambit, like, blowing up your V-Hand and a couple demons. That's a super low roll, but it's extremely possible too. And so you end up in this weird space with Gambit decks where when you're making a Gambit deck and it's the first day the card came out, people are like, okay, well, I don't want to lose to my opponent's Gambit. So how do I figure out a deck that doesn't lose to your opponent's Gambit? And then when you go all in on like, okay, I don't want to lose to my opponent's Gambit, it leads you to some really weird places. And this is the kind of thing where it's like, if I were to pick out like a long-term home for where Gambit is going to stick around here, it's going to be in Victoria Hand in metagames where he is dealing with like scalers and things of that nature, which I think is going to be most metagames. Like, I think a lot of what you'll see with this card is this is kind of what his permanent home is going to look like. But right now, people are still jockeying for position against other people playing it, which kind of makes this not a great choice until the metagame settles down and people start actually dealing with this. Because unlike the all-in Gambit list, this deck is actually like, okay, I'm playing against a Doom 2099 deck. I can do points pretty efficiently. Like, I have my Victoria Hand, I've got my Hood Misery, I've got things going on here that can actually generate points. Now, like every Victoria Hand deck, it sort of lives and dies by board space and tech. Whenever I play against this deck, it sort of feels like I just instantly win a lane because my opponents have used 3 of the spaces in there, and I can just be like, well, I know what the biggest possible thing you can put in there is, so I'm just going to win it. That is a dynamic you're going to have to be very conscious of when you play a deck like this. It is especially something you're going to have to be conscious of when you play the previous list. There's some board space issues that happen when you're doing like your best draws in decks like this, and there's just kind of something you got to take on the chin sometimes. But largely, I can see this version of the list being something that is successful. Notably, Red Guardian, Flex Slot. I don't know what the hell's supposed to go there, man. I don't want it to be Red Guardian. Like, Red Guardian is a card that kind of has anti-synergy with Gambit, because a lot of the stuff you're going to hit with a Red Guardian is, like, it's the stuff that's going to get blown up by Gambit. But at the same time, I don't have a better option. Like, you try to counter the negative decks by playing Mobius. You can play a Cosmo. You could play a Shadow King. What I really want is just something that's, like, pretty good against a lot of stuff. And Red Guardian's the only guy that fits the bill, and I'm running him, but I don't feel great about it. So keep in mind, very much a tech slot there. Feel free to mess around. So the sort of Gambit Olympics, which is to say, like, everyone's like, okay, what's the Gambit deck that beats the other Gambit decks? It's led a lot of people here. And I'm not convinced by this. Like, I'm convinced that it's quite good against other Gambit decks. I super buy that, because you're just playing a bunch of big guys and you don't really care if they blow anything up, because why would you care, right? You're an Arishem deck. You're chilling. But I'm just sort of not convinced by Arishem as a whole. That said, Gambit is probably the most compelling reason to play Arishem that it's gotten in a really long time. Arishem typically has one or two really pronounced weaknesses. The biggest weakness that Arishem has is it is quite bad at dealing with early game scalers and late game combos. So typically, this is the kind of deck that really has been bad for the last few months, because there's been a lot of Batroc and Sam Wilson and Craven, and there's been a lot of Sholo and Maverick, and there's been a lot of Star-Lord and Zola, right? And it is just not a deck that is super equipped to deal with that kind of stuff. It's best at being a mid-range crusher when people are playing much more fair mid-range. That's what this deck is built to do. And so it just kind of hasn't had a lot of time to shine recently. Like, people talk about how it's always represented in like Golden Gauntlets or whatever. 40 people took it, one person top 16 with it. That's not great. Like, it's about as bad as Arishem has basically ever been. And what Gambit does is at least give you like a pretty meaningfully good card against that stuff. Gambit is quite good against Batroc stuff. Gambit is quite good against certain kinds of scalers that you really don't want to see, even in matchups that are like not that, right? Like, if you're playing against Ramp, right, one of the things that really kills you against Ramp is they have a 2-drop that's 10 power. They don't have that anymore. Like, just a lot of decks where you're just like, I just need to not be behind. Like, I really need to not be behind. I want to be ahead going into the final turn of the game because I'm a Juggernaut Goliath deck. I need that, right? And Gambit really helps you not be behind. This is the most compelling reason to play Arishem in months, is that I think it's probably gotten better with the addition of Gambit, and it's quite good into a lot of other people who are relying very heavily on Gambit. As people start to develop and be like, okay, I don't need to play 75 Gambits a game, then it'll probably get worse. But if people are playing 75 Gambits a game, you can flush them in a dumpster. You're just like, I don't care. What? All my cards are 5s. Why would I care about your Gambit? And that's super real. It's also probably time to talk about, not necessarily the elephants in the room, but at least 2 cards you're going to see a lot of alongside this new Gambit. It's Valentina and Iron Patriot. I think it should be pretty apparent why that is, but basically the way Gambit works is that he counts the base cost of the thing. So Valentina will full trigger him. Iron Patriot will very often full trigger him. You get a lot of value out of getting this trigger for free, and it's a pretty cool way to deal with your early game struggles as an Arishem deck. Cerebro 3 is another list that I think could meaningfully survive as a Gambit list moving forward. It's quite interesting. This list comes from Jay Walla. There are 2 things I want to point out that I just personally hadn't considered in Cerebro 3 before. The first is Merlin instead of Scarlet Witch for location control, because it does give you the shot at location control, but more importantly, it also lets you flush things in and get extra energy. You're never using Polymorph, but Merlin is also a card that you can Magus for, where Scarlet Witch is not a card you can Magus for. And that's actually the cool part about this. The rest of this in C3, like, you could probably just put them in your C3 deck. You have Bastion, you have Sentinel, it's probably enough. I've seen people going a little bit further afield, going for like storm things and all of that, but keep in mind Merlin spells will count, and that's a pretty notable addition here. Largely, I think this is a deck that's exploring some really interesting spaces, but what I'm really trying to get across here is not that you have to play this specific C3 list, but the Gambit just seems pretty good in C3. Like, Gambit seems like a very relevant and powerful card in a list like this that can really do some work. And the more I think about decks like C3, you know, I've recently sort of been on a crusade, like, got to take a point off Frigga, got to take a point off Prodigy. I kind of wonder if C3 just means you can't do that. Like, it's just one of those things where you're like, oh yeah, maybe that's a terrible idea. But of course, C3 being a deck with such a minimal curve means that it is quite vulnerable to the people who are doing mono Gambit spam. The all-in Gambit decks are really good against this. But when we sort of start forecasting into, like, what is Gambit going to look like in a little bit, this is the kind of thing that it could look like. Like, this is a long-term home for this card. And maybe the all-in Gambit stuff shows up, but I don't know. I have been burned in the past overestimating the player base's willingness to switch decks to counter something, right? I've definitely been burned in the past being like, oh, this card is counterable, and the player base is like, well, I'm not doing that. And it's like, okay, well, I guess you got to nerf it then, right? Like, but Gambit's not even like counterable. He just like kind of can't beat a lot of the stuff that goes really tall. Like if you're just like, I'm going to play a deck that like most of my power comes from 5s, just going to beat the guy. And so like a lot of me is thinking it's time to look for, I guess what you call sustainable Gambit options that are not all in on the guy. Even though the all in stuff is powerful, it's the kind of thing that feels like in a week, probably going to be a lot less relevant to what people are actually playing. I am nothing if not an absolute hack, so it should come as no surprise that one of the first instincts that occurs to me, and to be, I'm going to blame this on somebody else. I'm going to blame this on Jay Walla, who's also the person who made that Cerebro list. I'm going to blame him for this, but I am a hack, and it is like, okay, well, what if we put Sholo and Gambit together? And it's not like, normally, when you do a fusion like this, it's like, okay, I think I'm covering for a weakness or something. This is just like, you know, I kind of think that like Prodigy and Frigga are probably pretty good here anyway. And I'm interested in seeing how things end up working out with like, oh, you know, maybe I'll be able to like, yeah, Sholo on 5 and Prodigy it. Like, there's stuff here. You know, it's not the end of the world. But largely, I think that what this deck is doing is saying like, I would like to beat other Sholo decks. That's sort of the edge Gambit gives it. That's what I eventually got to. But that wasn't the impetus behind why this was supposed to happen. It was just like, well, a lot of the other time you do 2 fusions, you just like take a good deck and then put it with another good deck. It'll probably be pretty good. And that was pretty much the entirety of the work here. I'll note that Electra, not like a permanent inclusion. It's just deference to like the current existence of Gambit and like, okay, we're going to beat Sholo decks, right? So we're going to be a Gambit deck and a Sholo deck. And that's going to mean that we're going to need to like blow up things that are like demons from the hood, or against another Sholo deck, we're going to blow up the thing they put the Maverick buff on with that Electra. Not a permanent inclusion. Don't worry. Another thing that I've been kicking around is like, do I want Iron Patriot instead of Kate Bishop? Kate Bishop is amazing. I love 1-drops from a Sholo. Like, what do I have to do? Is there more work here that has to be done? This feels like a very rough sketch, but it did pretty well when I played it. And I'm not sure it's like a permanent solution to everything, but it is just sort of an example of where my head goes. It's like, all right, well, let's be a hack. You know, let's just put the good deck with the other good deck and call it a day. And it was pretty good. The big baby Agamotto list is another place that Gambit can actually legitimately fit in, because there are just a bunch of free versions of cards that are created in here, and a bunch of ways to just do something dumb enough that you're probably going to get to 5. Between the skills and Infinity Ultron and Iron Patriot and Valentina, you're probably getting to 5. And, you know, sometimes you can images of Icon of Gambit, right? It's not the most common thing, because frankly, a lot of your cards are bigger than 3, or at least going to make it a 50-50 by being 3. But you can do it, and that's obviously like a pretty powerful thing to have access to. In terms of hybrids with Sholo, I think this one's just a much more natural fit. Like, the hack deck building is very hack deck building. I think if you were already playing a deck that kind of looked like this, or maybe this exact list with a different card in there, I think he is additive here in much the same way that he's additive to Arishem, where it's just like, I like having another good card in decks like these. I just really like another card that can be like a percentage of my game plan, right? Like, this is mostly just going to be like a pretty good contributor to my game plan. And then sometimes it can be like 100% of my game plan if I'm blowing up 12 cost of stuff on their side of the board, right? Like, that is really powerful if you can pull it off, right? Like, that images stuff works like wonders. And so there are really cool things you can do with a deck like this. There are really interesting things you can do with a deck like this. And of all of the sort of hybrid Sholo lists that I've seen, this is the one that I think is actually the most successful at actually bridging what this deck is trying to do. Okay, so we talked about Gambit. Would you like to know how to farm him? I thought so. Played a lot of this recently. It's pretty good for obvious reasons. Like, if Gambit can't blow up your Star-Lord, they just aren't playing things that meaningfully interact with you. I have yet to see a Gambit play either a Cosmo or a CGR. And, you know, again, temporary state of the metagame. They're still trying to figure themselves out. But, like, it literally just hasn't happened. And it's like, okay, I mean, if you're just going to let me Star-Lord combo, I'm going to Star-Lord combo you. The same is true of the Star-Lord negative version. It's just like, oh, wow, that's incredibly free. The Gambit decks are just sort of fundamentally incapable of beating, like, I'm going to play a Black Panther on turn 4, Zola it, and then copy the Zola. Like, they just don't do it. And so you're just like, oh, right, okay. Even my bad plans kind of put you in the ground here. Like, There's just a lot of stuff that card is totally incapable of dealing with, which is why I sort of like the V-Hand and the Cerebro stuff, because it's like, at least then you have a plan A, but the all-in Gambit stuff, you're just falling apart. 2099, pretty straightforward, pretty simple deck. All-in Gambit stuff can like blow up some Doom bots and things of that nature, but you got a lot of power here. One note is that in Gambit matchups, you're much, much, much more likely to want to be playing things like Dr. Doom instead of Aurora. I've actually included Mercury and Cannonball in here, largely because I think Jack Flag seems a little risky in a world where people are doing all-in Gambit stuff. But Mercury Cannonball is actually the kind of thing where it's like, you know, you could turn 5 and just like blow up a Gambit, and it's like, oh, that's pretty good, right? Like you could just do things. This is a deck that I would expect to largely come out of this with a positive matchup against Gambit overall. Same goes for ramp. It's not like it's free, but you're definitely favored. You have just a ton of ability to do cool things with a ramp deck. Really, I think the two most important cards in this deck are actually 2 of the 5s, Cosmic Ghost Rider and Legion. They're where most of your cube equity comes from. I think most of the people that you play against are going to have a pretty good idea of what you're doing, and if they have a pretty good idea of what you're doing, that's usually pretty bad for your cube equity, but cards like Legion and CGR can really catch people out if they're expecting cards to have abilities or expecting locations to be the things that people want them to be. There's a lot of upside in those two cards specifically. The rest of this is just very stock ramp, where it's like, look, dude, your Gambit deck, I don't care. I have an Infinite on the board. I have a Galactus First Steps on the board. I don't think you beat either of those things, and that's just usually a pretty safe bet. A lot of your power comes from 5s as well, so it's like, as much as you are losing out on being able to count on the 2s, if you are able to, for example, Electro Blink, it's just like, that's 2 5s at like 8 or 9 power at minimum. You're just very happy about that. It's pretty straightforward as a deck. Like, this is a deck where almost all of the power in the deck is going to cost way too much for Gambit to even meaningfully interact with. It's not free because the decks like V-Hand are able to deal with what you're able to deal with, but it's a pretty good matchup. So, what's the verdict on Gambit? Well, he's certainly extremely powerful against certain types of strategies. Because of his new release and his power against those strategies, I feel personally like there's probably a lot more of him in the metagame than there will be long term. He's providing a bit of a warping factor that is based on him being new and cool and powerful, and on people not necessarily fully processing what they have to do exactly to try to beat these all-in Gambit decks, which feel incredibly oppressive if you're playing something they beat. They also feel incredibly unimpressive if you're playing something they lose to. Pretty polarized matchup spread that I think will largely decrease his play rate. Now, the reason I mention this is because a lot of what you're doing right now is playing Gambit decks that beat other Gambit decks. Arishem instead of the V-Hand stuff, the all-in Gambit decks, things like that. Those are the ones that I would have the biggest asterisks in my mind right now next to, where it's like, I think Arishem is going to want to play Gambit. I don't think it's going to be this good for this for very long. The all-in Gambit deck's definitely like going to be one of those things where it's like extreme metagame call, almost Galactus-esque is kind of what I think about for that. I wonder, because it's possible I'm wrong here, but largely I think that like this card will sort of start to even out and end up as like a C3 Victoria hand card that is definitely good in those decks. But I think it's possible people are overselling this guy right now. I do think he is quite a powerful card. Like, really, 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 really strong. But he's limited in scope in certain ways that make him, if he has a target on his back, quite beatable. And as the card that just came out, he's got a target on his back. So it's going to be interesting to see how this shapes up. But definitely, you know, when I came into the season and I did my season predictions video, I said this and Iska were the two 4.5s out of 10, or 4.5s out of 5 out of 10 in the season. And so far, that is sort of what it feels like at the very least. This is a very powerful card. I don't know that we've had a very powerful card that's this polarized before, though. So I'm really interested to see just what exactly this guy's going to end up doing long term. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one.